This is a game I made a few years ago called BreakBall. I cobbled it together in a couple months and played it a few times with some friends, but never ended up releasing it to the public because it wasn't very stable. The core idea of the game stuck in my mind though, and I really wanted to make it a game that others could play too, so last summer I started reworking it fully from scratch and uploading devlogs of it on YouTube. Now after adding collisions, shooting and sounds in the last video, the only thing it lacked from the old version was different maps, player death and multiple rounds. First I implemented the player death, and I started by once again basically copying the code from the previous version of the game and modifying it to be a little less botched. When the player gets hit by a ball, it spawns a dead player object in its place and deletes itself. The reason we spawn a dead impersonator instead of just giving the player that functionality is that it would require all the functionality like moving, aiming, shooting, as well as the death animation to check if the player is dead or not, which would make the script needlessly complicated. So just like separating different functionality into different scripts, we separate the life and death of a player into separate objects. Next, I added a timer that starts when a player dies and resets the room after a couple seconds. This is how it worked in the old game as well, and while it worked for now, it wouldn't for long. I then added a simple transition screen, which showed the player's scores in a very non-final way. I added in all the maps from the previous game, and made a simple script that picked a random one at the start of each round, while never picking the same one twice in a row. This was most of the functionality from the old game done, if you don't count the other game modes, and the game was very playable now. But the plan was always to get this game further than what the previous one was capable of due to it basically being built out of sand, and one of the biggest features I wanted to add was player selection. Now if you remember, I actually already implemented controller allocation in the first video, but the idea was never to just add and remove players in the middle of the game, but to rather have a separate player selection screen before the game. And so here it is. You can assign controllers and change the player features, and while I'm currently only showing 4 player slots, and while the game may very well crash if you try to add more than that right now, in the end the game should allow for a maximum of 8 players, possibly more if it's in any way sensible at that point. Of course, player customization is the most important part of any game, but it only really matters if you can carry the customizations over to the actual game. And while it seems like this could happen automatically, and while I kinda wish it did, it turns out you have to actually code that in. So when the program is running, there's always a root node that I've named engine, and this is a parent node to everything else. The engine has a child called player select data, which will be relevant soon. When we want to go to the player select menu, the engine spawns the player select menu node, and when you assign controllers, you get player containers. When you want to start the game, the player select menu goes through each player container and creates a dictionary of all the relevant player info, and sends it to a list in the player select data node. After all that data is transmitted, we can remove the player select menu. Next we spawn the actual game area, which I call the room, and it goes through the player select data list and creates a player for each of the player data dictionaries in it. Each player gets their corresponding dictionary and matches its data, like the color and outfit, to the player selections. In the game it works like this, and for those of you that aren't interested in how games work under the hood, this whole explanation was simply to bring up the fact that making games is not easy. I also made it so the player data could be loaded back into the player select menu, meaning you could remove a controller and add it back in, and all your customizations were still there. Or you could start the game and go back to the player selection screen, and it would automatically have all the players there. But now that we could have more than 2 players in the room, a lot of things became problematic. First of all the room layouts were designed for exactly 2 players spawning at exactly these 2 locations, and while some of the maps worked with more players, some of them had walls where the other players were supposed to spawn, and almost all of them had nothing in between the vertical spawn locations. You see, a requirement I have for all the maps is that the players can't have a direct line of sight to another player at the start of the round, since that would make it a situation where the player who shoots first when a round starts always wins and immediately kills the other player, which isn't exactly fun. Now, I didn't want to start remaking all the old maps to accommodate for the extra players, and I knew that I wanted to increase the map size for more players anyway, as this size was very well suited for 2 but quite claustrophobic for more than that. So I started making new maps that would be used instead of the old ones when 3 or 4 people were playing, and I plan on making even bigger maps for 5 to 8 players. Now, coming back to the line of sight thing, it was always pretty simple when accounting for 2 players, since there was only a single line between them, going diagonally across the whole room. But now with 4 players, there were suddenly 6 different lines to take into account between all the players, and I had to make sure they were all covered. Another thing was that with more players, moving on to the next round didn't work anymore. If you remember from before, we simply ended the round a few seconds after a player died, and while this worked for 2 players, it obviously didn't work for more than that, since it would end after the first player died. So, to know when to trigger the end of a round, I had to know how many players there were alive at any time, and start the round end timer when that number was 1. So the way I implemented this was a simple script that went through all the child nodes of the room each frame, and counted up the amount of nodes with a player tag on them. I'm gonna repeat that. To know how many players were alive at any time, which isn't a number that changes very often, I went through every node in the room and counted the amount of player nodes from that, every single frame, 60 times a second. Now, this is not a very good way of doing this, and while I never really prioritize code efficiency or optimization in my game, because it's so lightweight you'd struggle to make it lag running on a calculator, I do want to explain just how bad this piece of code here is. So, if we count the amount of commands we need to run each frame to keep track of the player amount, this gets run once a frame to reset the player counter. The amount of times this loop is run depends on the amount of children the room has, which would be the wall tile map, the background, the ball spawner, each player, each ball and ball trail, as well as any other nodes. We can just approximate that with like 12. This is run once for every for loop, and this once for every player, which we can once again just decide there are 3 of. So in total we're running 28 commands per frame, which is 1680 commands a second. So in addition to being very inefficient for the task, this was actually very buggy and didn't work all the time, so I had to redesign it. And the way I remade it was so much better. If you look at the graph I made for saving and transferring player selections, you might realize my eureka moment here, which is that we already know the starting player amount from here. And if we add a line to the player death script that removes 1 from the player amount counter, then we have a more reliable and much faster way of keeping track of the player amount. And that's all it takes. And as simple as the code here looks, it requires carrying data from other scripts and getting the player amount from the player select data, instead of just counting the players on the screen, which is what I did at first. So I'm not exactly surprised I didn't find the right answer immediately. So, just for fun, let's compare the efficiencies of the 2 implementations, so we can get a better idea of the sort of difference we're working with. Now, since both of the commands in the new implementation are only called when something happens instead of every frame, it makes more sense to start with calculating the average amount of times between the commands. And because the times between the commands completely depend on what's happening in the game, we have to approximate once again. From some experience, I can say that an average round between 2 players takes about 20 seconds. With more players it could take more time, but we're in the ballpark. If we keep the previous assumption of 3 players, that's a death every 10 seconds. From there, the times per second are just inversions of those numbers, and we end up with about 3/20, or 0.15 commands per second. Compared to the old implementation 1680, that's quite a lot better. About 11,200 times better, in fact, and while with different and equally sensible input parameters, we could have gotten a number anywhere from 5,000 to 30,000, that's still pretty damn good. And while neither of these implementations would really make much of a difference to the game's performance, unless you're running it on a smart toilet brush, with enough improvements like this, it just might. Plus, I don't know about you, but I'm gonna sleep a lot better knowing this piece of code has been banished from my game.